It was supposed to be a simple weekend away, just me and my old friend Marcus. We'd been talking about doing this for a while, but life always got in the way. Work, family, all the usual distractions. Finally, we made the plan. A weekend trip to a secluded cabin in the woods, something far off the beaten path. No phones, no internet. Just the two of us, a few beers, and the quiet of nature. The cabin itself was an odd choice, even for someone like me who enjoyed being off-grid. It wasn't a log cabin or a wooden frame structure. Instead, it was an old glass cabin, a relic from some past architectural trend. All four walls were made of thick, weatherproof glass, the kind that kept the cold out but made the place feel exposed, like you were in a fish tank. The cabin was situated in a secluded part of the woods near a small, unmarked road, far enough from the nearest town that nobody would bother us. We drove up in Marcus's beat-up truck, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as we made our way up the winding road. I was surprised we even found the place, considering how far out it was. The GPS on Marcus's phone had been spotty for the last few miles, but somehow we managed to stumble across the cabin. We parked the truck and I got out, stretching my legs after the long ride. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. The trees around us were dense, their branches swaying gently in the wind. It was quiet, almost too quiet. "Here we are," Marcus said, rubbing his hands together. "Looks like something out of a movie, huh?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the cabin. It was a strange sight. The glass walls gave it an almost fragile appearance, like it could shatter at any moment. The structure was simple, square, and modern, completely out of place in this rustic wilderness. But it had a certain charm despite its unusual design. The cabin had been abandoned for years, according to the listing we found online. The owner had died, and it was left to rot, but it had been cleaned up recently for short-term rentals. I pulled my bag from the truck, noticing how the air was growing colder with each passing minute. The temperature was dropping fast, and nightfall wasn't far off. Inside, the cabin was as odd as the exterior. It was bare, with only a few pieces of old furniture. A worn-out couch, a simple dining table, and a bed with an old quilt thrown on top. The glass walls gave an odd sense of being both inside and outside at the same time. I could feel the chill of the air, and yet, there was something unsettling about being surrounded by glass in the middle of nowhere. Marcus didn't seem bothered by the atmosphere. He went straight to the fridge, cracking open a beer, while I wandered around, inspecting the place. As I looked out of one of the windows, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were thick and dark, and the underbrush was dense. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Later that night, after a couple of beers and some snacks, we decided to light the small wood stove in the corner and settle in. The fire crackled, and the warmth slowly filled the room. We sat there in silence, watching the flames dance, the flickering light casting long shadows across the glass walls. It felt peaceful at first, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. I'm not the paranoid type. I've spent my fair share of time in remote places, but there was something about this cabin that felt different. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that the cabin seemed too open, too exposed. There were no curtains, no real way to block out the view of the outside world. The glass walls made everything feel too transparent. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked suddenly, breaking my thoughts. I froze. The fire crackled in the background, and the wind howled through the trees outside. But there was something else. A faint rustling noise, like footsteps in the distance. It was hard to tell if it was just the wind or something else. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "I don't know," Marcus said, leaning forward. It sounded like someone's walking outside. I stood up and walked over to the window, my heart beating a little faster. I couldn't see anything, Just the dense trees, the shadows stretching as the light from the fire flickered behind me. I shook my head. "It's probably just some animal," I said, trying to reassure myself more than him. But Marcus didn't seem convinced. "You sure? It's weird out here. I don't like it." The night dragged on, and the strange feeling didn't go away. We tried to settle down, but every little noise made us jump. The wind, the creaking of the cabin, the occasional rustle in the trees. It all seemed amplified, like the night was closing in on us. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I took the couch and Marcus sat up in the bed. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches scraping against the glass, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling, but sleep wouldn't come. The noises outside were too persistent, too unnatural. I don't know how much time passed before I heard it. A soft tap on the glass, followed by a faint scraping sound. My eyes snapped open, and I immediately sat up. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, thudding against my chest. The wind was still howling, but there was something else now. A soft, deliberate sound, like someone was gently tapping on the glass from the outside. I slowly stood up, trying not to make any noise. I looked over at Marcus, who was still fast asleep. He didn't hear it, or if he did, he wasn't reacting. I crept toward the window, holding my breath. As I reached the edge of the glass, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, just outside the window, was a man. He was standing motionless, his face partially obscured by the shadows. His clothes were ragged, his hair long and unkempt. But what caught my attention was his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, fixed on me. I froze, staring back, unable to move or speak. The man didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this man? How did he get out there? Was he dangerous? I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping had stopped, but I could still feel his eyes on me. The cabin felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in. I looked at Marcus, still oblivious to the situation, and then back at the window. The man was gone. I exhaled, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of prank, a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night staring out of the glass, watching for any sign of movement. The man didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The sun came up, and the cabin seemed a little less suffocating. But I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Marcus woke up a few hours later, groggy and unaware of what had happened. I didn't mention the man. Instead, I packed up my things, urging Marcus to do the same. We were leaving. As we drove away from the cabin, I glanced back at the glass walls one last time. The woods behind it were still silent, like they were holding their breath. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back to that cabin. My name's Dylan Reed. I was 39 when I started building the cabin. It was late October 2022. The summer had dragged on too long, and when the first storms finally rolled through Central Oregon, I packed up everything I had in Portland and drove east into the woods. I had a piece of land I bought 2 years earlier, a few forested acres near the edge of the Ochoco Mountains.
No utilities, no neighbors.
No cell signal. That was the point. I wanted the kind of silence you could only get when you were completely alone. After the divorce and the layoffs at work, and the pile of nothing waiting for me in the city, I wanted something real I could build from the ground up. Something that wouldn't leave me, something I could hold in my hands and say, "This is mine." So I built a plan. Small cabin, 1 room, sloped roof, with stove, basic insulation, just enough to survive the winter in. It was raining on and off when I got there. Not a heavy rain, just a cold, stubborn mist that soaked everything over time. I parked my truck in the clearing where the old logging road gave out, about a 1/4 mile from the site I'd marked on satellite maps. I hauled lumber and supplies in by foot. Took hours. No trail, just wet pine needles and mud. I didn't mind. That kind of quiet labor is good for the mind. By the time I got the tools under a tarp and pitched my tent, the light was almost gone. The rain picked up again that night. I slept in damp clothes with the sound of water tapping steady on the nylon above me, and I remember feeling calm, tired, but good. The next morning, I started digging the footing for the cabin. I'd watched all the videos, read the forums. I wasn't a pro, but I wasn't stupid either. The plan was 12 by 16 feet, enough space for a cot, a stove, and a table. The soil was wetter than I expected. The deeper I went, the more it clung to the shovel. My boots were caked in mud. I worked all day and only finished 2 of the 6 footings. That night I heard something. I was lying in the tent, half asleep, when I picked up on a rhythm in the rain that didn't sound natural. A kind of crunching noise outside. I sat up, listened. Nothing moved, but I knew that sound. That was footsteps. I turned off the headlamp and held still. The forest was black, deeper than city dark. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I waited maybe 10 minutes, listening to nothing but rain and the odd creak of trees moving against each other. No wind, just that soft pressure you get before a bigger storm. Eventually, I drifted off. In the morning, I found nothing out of place. No tracks, no sign anyone had been there. Could have been a deer, I told myself. But even then, I didn't believe it. Over the next week, I kept my head down and worked. I made a routine. Wake up with the light. Eat something fast. Work through the morning until my hands were too stiff to hold a hammer. Then rest and go again till dark. I kept the fire small at night. The forest soaked everything in silence. I stopped listening to music or using my phone for anything but photos. I wanted the quiet. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The build went slower than I'd planned. The rain didn't let up. Half the time I had to tarp the whole worksite just to keep the floor dry. My fingers cracked from the cold. My boots were always wet, but I kept going. The foundation came together first. Then the walls went up. I framed it with 2x6s, sheathed it in plywood. I covered the roof in a roll of underlayment and metal panels. I was proud of how square it all looked. No leaks either, but I kept feeling watched. It wasn't every night, just certain ones. The air would get thick even when the rain was light. There was no sound.
No frogs, no owls.
No wind, just a silence so deep I could hear the blood in my ears. It's hard to explain, but it felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep well on those nights. Once, I heard what sounded like wood snapping near the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. Nothing. The beam didn't reach far through the fog, but I could feel something out there. You can call it nerves, paranoia. I don't care. I know what I felt. By the 3rd week, I was close to done. The windows were in, door framed and hung, insulation packed between the studs. I didn't bother with drywall. I liked the raw look of the wood. Felt honest. Honest was what I was after. That and heat. I got the small wood stove in place with help from a pulley and a lot of sweat. It felt good to light the first fire and watch the smoke curl from the stovepipe into the cold gray air. But the feeling didn't go away. One night, probably a few days before Halloween, I heard something behind the cabin. Not just footsteps, a dragging sound, like someone pulling a branch across the ground. I was sitting inside with the stove going, lights off, just the orange flicker of flames. I froze, listened. The sound stopped. I waited a few minutes and stepped outside. It was raining hard, cold. My breath came in clouds. I didn't see anything at first. Then I spotted it. Tracks, deep ones.
Bootprints.
They came from the woods behind the cabin and circled halfway around it before disappearing into the brush again. No branches were broken. No other signs of movement. Just those dark indentations in the mud. I followed them maybe 30 feet before I lost them in the undergrowth. That night I didn't sleep. I kept the fire low and sat with my back to the wall, axe across my lap. Every creak of the stove made me flinch. In the morning, the prints were gone. Rain had smoothed them out, erased them like they were never there. I wanted to leave. I thought about it a lot, but the cabin was almost done, and I'd worked too hard. I told myself I was being stupid, that no one was out there, that maybe I'd made those prints myself and forgotten. But I knew better. I hadn't been behind the cabin in days, not since I finished the stovepipe. I kept working, but I started carrying a knife on my belt, just in case. The last big task was skirting the base. I didn't want animals crawling underneath, and the air gap would bleed heat. I used cutboards to box it in, left a crawl hatch, and filled the space with dry leaves and scrap insulation. It looked clean, solid. I could have moved in that day if I wanted, but I didn't. I decided to camp one last night outside, just to be sure everything was sealed up and holding heat right. The inside stayed warm, dry, even with the storm that rolled in around dusk. It was the worst rain I'd seen since I got there. Sheets of it coming down sideways, trees bending, tarp flapping hard against the ropes. I stayed dry enough in the tent, but the noise was insane. Constant roar. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound. This time, it circled the tent. I sat up, heart pounding. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. It stopped behind the tent. Couldn't see a thing. My flashlight was under the blanket. I reached for it as quietly as I could, turned it on, unzipped the flap, aimed the beam into the dark. Nothing. I stepped out barefoot in the mud, scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Rain hit the light in streaks. Wind whipped the trees. I stood there for maybe a minute, freezing, scanning in slow circles. Then I saw it. Not a person. A rope. A length of thick, muddy rope tied to the tree beside the cabin. I didn't tie that. It looked old, frayed, wet all the way through, like it had been left there for years. But it hadn't been there that morning. I was sure of it. I followed the rope with the light. It led from the base of the tree down into the brush behind the cabin. It disappeared into the mud. I didn't follow it. Not that night. I cut it loose with my knife and threw it in the fire pit. The next day, I packed everything up, took only the essentials, left the rest in the cabin. I didn't even lock the door. I hiked back to the truck and drove out without looking back. Mud flying off the tires, wipers struggling to keep up. I made it to Bend by sunset and checked into a cheap motel. Slept for 12 hours straight. A week later, I came back. I brought a friend with me that time. He had a background in law enforcement. I told him I thought maybe someone was squatting on the land or messing with me. We searched the area around the cabin. Found nothing. No more rope.
No prints.
No sign anyone had ever been there but me. But the hatch under the cabin was open. The nails I'd used to seal it down were scattered in the mud. Inside the crawl space, we found scraps of food. Cans, a broken lighter, and a single dirty blanket balled up against the far wall. Someone had been living under my cabin. We reported it, but the county didn't care. No one was caught. No one claimed the stuff. I sealed the hatch again, this time with bolts and steel mesh. I spent one last night there that fall. Inside, door locked, fire going, knife by my side. The rain came again. I listened to it for hours, but nothing moved. The forest was quiet, and I finally slept. It was the spring of 2015 when I first got the call about the property. My Uncle Roy had passed a few weeks earlier. He was a quiet man, never had kids of his own, and he'd mostly stayed out of touch with the family. Still, for whatever reason, he left me his farm cabin tucked away in northern Wisconsin, somewhere out near Rusk County. I was 31 at the time, working construction out of Green Bay. I didn't know much about the place aside from what I remembered as a kid. 2 short visits when I was 10 and maybe again when I was 13. I remembered it as a cold, drafty old house with uneven floorboards and a ton of land around it. It was quiet, too quiet for a kid. After I signed the paperwork and sorted through the bank stuff, I took a week off work and made plans to drive out there alone. I thought maybe I'd clean the place up, take inventory, maybe think about selling it or turning it into a rental. The drive took almost 6 hours. I remember pulling off the main road onto a narrow dirt lane that wound through some thick pine and birch woods, past 2 rusted-out mailboxes leaning crooked at the start of the drive. The gravel cracked under the tires, and it felt like I was the first one there in a long time. The cabin came into view just after a bend. It sat low to the ground, dark brown siding with a steep tin roof and one chimney leaning slightly to the left. The porch had half collapsed, and one of the wooden steps was missing entirely. 2 old tractor tires were leaned up against the side of the shed, and beside them, a rusted-out deer stand was lying on its side. Tall grass and saplings had overtaken what used to be a small fenced garden. When I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me first. It was cold, even though it was mid-April, and the smell of damp dirt and moss was thick. There weren't any sounds, no birds, no wind, just stillness. I walked up to the front door, brushed away some old cobwebs from the handle, and turned the key. The inside smelled like old wood and dust. A musty dampness hung in the air, like wet paper that had dried out again. The cabin was all 1 floor, open living area with a cast iron stove in the corner, a tiny kitchen off to the left, 1 small bathroom, and a bedroom in the back. It was darker than I remembered, with just 1 small window in the kitchen and 2 facing the front. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time. A pair of muddy boots still sat by the door. Some mail was stacked on the kitchen table, postmarked years back. A hunting calendar from 2012 was pinned to the wall above the fridge. I started going through drawers and cabinets, mostly finding rusted utensils, old tools, and canned food past expiration. The bathroom still had soap on the sink. The bedroom was worse. It smelled like mouse droppings and mold. The mattress was stained and sagging. A few clothes still hung in the closet. I opened 1 drawer and found some rifle rounds wrapped in paper. I spent that whole first day airing the place out. Opened all the windows, swept, dusted, and bagged up garbage. I brought a sleeping bag and a foam pad, knowing the bed wasn't going to be usable. That night, I lit a fire in the wood stove, heated a can of beans, and sat there listening to the cracks in the walls as they expanded and settled. It was colder than I'd expected, and the wind had picked up. The whole place groaned like an old ship at sea. I was used to noise, used to hearing trucks outside my apartment or people next door. This silence was different, pressed in. When I turned off my headlamp and lay down to sleep, every creak in the house felt too loud. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something shuffle outside, like a foot dragging in the leaves. But when I sat up and listened, it was gone. I told myself it was probably a raccoon. By the second day, I was already uneasy. Something about the place just didn't feel right. I kept finding little things that didn't add up. A deadbolt on the inside of the bedroom closet. A a scratch pattern along the bottom of the back door that looked like something had been clawing at it. A lock on the outside of the shed, not the inside. When I opened the shed, it was empty except for an overturned chair, a folded tarp, and what looked like a scorched fire pit made of stones in the middle. There was a thick smell of charred wood, even though it didn't look like it had been used in a long time. I found more strange things that evening. Behind the cabin, there was an old well, half collapsed and covered with a plywood board. I pried it up with a crowbar just to look. Inside, there wasn't much to see, just blackness and the smell of rot. But what made me stop was what I found around the edge of the well. Rope fibers and a piece of duct tape caught between the boards. Nothing that told a whole story, but enough that I didn't like standing near it anymore. That night, the wind was worse. At one point, I thought I saw lights in the trees, far off, faint like a lantern, but it didn't move like a flashlight would. I watched for maybe 5 minutes before it faded. I told myself it was some reflection, maybe headlights on a far-off road, but the nearest road was 2 miles back. And I knew it. I barely slept. The scratching sound at the back door came again around 2:45 a.m. I sat up in my sleeping bag, held my breath. It was slow, deliberate, not like an animal. It scratched in sets, 2 drags, then a pause, then again. I waited for a while before getting up and shining my flashlight through the back window. Nothing, just wet leaves and tree trunks. I didn't even go outside the next morning. I spent hours just staring at the trees through the front window, trying to work out whether I should leave. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the curiosity. Maybe I thought it was just my imagination, the stress, the silence. By afternoon, I forced myself to do more cleaning. I opened a crawl space behind the stove I hadn't noticed before, just a small hatch with a rusted ring handle. Inside was dark, but my flashlight showed it was empty except for some loose boards and rat droppings. One thing did catch my eye though, a broken Polaroid photo under one of the boards. It showed the edge of the shed, but in the corner, there was a blurry figure standing by the door. Couldn't make out any details, but they weren't holding a tool or anything, just standing there. The image was torn halfway through. I threw the photo back into the crawl space and closed the hatch. That night was worse than the others. I didn't sleep at all. Around 1 a.m., I heard the front door creak. Not rattle, not bend, creak, like someone had pressed their weight on it. I sat up, my flashlight already in my hand. The door didn't open, but the handle turned. I was frozen. My heart felt like it would split open. After maybe 30 seconds, it stopped. Nothing happened after that. I sat with my back to the wall the rest of the night, flashlight in one hand, my uncle's hunting knife in the other. Morning came and I told myself I had to leave. That was it. Curiosity or not, this place wasn't right. I packed everything into the truck by 8 a.m., locked the door behind me, and started the engine. But as I looked up in the rearview mirror before backing up, I saw something. Not a person, just a mark on the back window of the cabin. A handprint, small, like a kid's, but no one had been inside. I hadn't seen it before. The window had been clean. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the truck in drive and left. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway. I didn't go back to that cabin for over a year. I let it sit, untouched. Eventually, I hired a guy from a local company to clear the property and get it prepped for sale. When he called me 2 weeks later, he said everything looked fine except for one thing. The well in the back had been filled in, but not by them. Somebody had poured concrete into it. He asked if I'd done it myself. I hadn't. I told him to go ahead and board up the cabin too. I never gave him the key, just told him to nail the door shut and leave the rest. I sold the property that fall to some guy from Minnesota who wanted land for deer hunting. I signed the paperwork without ever going back. I never found out what my uncle was into or why that place felt the way it did. There were no records of police reports, nothing weird in the paperwork. But sometimes, late at night when things are quiet, I still hear the sound of that slow scratching in my head. Not loud, just enough that I remember it exactly. And every time I think about that handprint on the glass, I wonder how long it had been there before I ever stepped foot inside. It was the winter of 2004 when I found myself out near the edge of Colorado, almost brushing the border of Utah. I was 34 then, not really the type who planned ahead for vacations or needed much company. I just wanted silence. Not the kind you find in your apartment when you shut the door after a long day, but the kind of silence that feels like the world has stopped spinning for a while. That kind of peace only ever came to me when I was in the mountains. I was working construction at the time, laying down insulation in newer homes popping up around the Denver suburbs. That job paid all right, but it wore on the bones and the back. You wake up sore, you go to sleep sore, and somewhere in between you lose your sense of time. I'd put in 2 straight months without a day off. My foreman noticed I was burning out and practically ordered me to take a week. So I packed up my Jeep with the essentials, thermal gear, a camp stove, canned food, some books, a rifle for any trouble, and my hunting knife. I'd gotten word through a guy at work that his uncle had a cabin way out near Dinosaur National Monument. Wasn't listed anywhere, just something his uncle used to lease from a buddy. A spot where he used to go elk hunting, but it hadn't been visited in over a year. The guy said I could use it for free so long as I didn't burn it down. I wrote down directions he gave me. Mostly dirt roads and landmarks, like turn left at the broken cattle fence, and if you pass the rock with orange spray paint, you've gone too far. The drive took me nearly 8 hours, and I only had radio for maybe 2 of them. After that, it was just long roads and that still open sky pressing down on you like a heavy hand. The trail leading to the cabin was a mess. Packed snow in some places, muddy ruts in others. My Jeep barely made it up one stretch where the path wrapped around a low ridge. When I finally saw the roof line of the cabin through the trees, I felt something in my chest loosen. It looked simple, with siding grayed by time, metal chimney, slanted roof. No electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove and a stream about a half-mile off. I settled in pretty fast. First night was uneventful. Cold, sure, but I'd brought enough wool and propane to make it manageable. I lit the stove, made some stew, and read until the light started to fade. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin in long breaths. It wasn't eerie at first. I'd camped enough to know how the wind moves through trees. But as I lay in bed that night, an old cot with a mattress that dipped in the middle, I started noticing little things that stuck with me. The wind never really changed. It didn't gust or howl like I expected. It pushed in waves, long and steady, as if something just kept walking past the windows. That was the first night. The second day, I chopped some firewood. There was a small axe left behind and a splitting stump out back. Tracks from elk, maybe deer, ran close to the treeline. I didn't see any animals though. No barges, no skirréus, no noise. Just that wind again. While chopping wood, I noticed something strange. The axe had marks on its handle, shallow cuts. Not from use, but deliberate, almost like tally marks. They were too clean to be accidental. 7 in total, spaced evenly apart. That put a little knot in my stomach, but I figured it was just the old owner keeping track of something. Elk taken, maybe. A harmless thought. That night, the wind came back again. That same steady rhythm. It didn't hit the walls or roof, just moved through the air in a pattern I couldn't place. I'd heard it the night before, but now it felt closer. More deliberate, like footsteps pacing around the cabin. I told myself it was in my head. I even put my boots by the door in case I needed to step out fast. At about 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of something scraping. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't natural either. It came from under the cabin, a dry, dragging sound, like something hard moving across frozen dirt. I held my breath for a good 30 seconds, thinking maybe it was a branch or an animal, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it came. When I got up in the morning, I checked under the cabin. Just crawl space, nothing there, no prints, no scratch marks. But the dirt was smooth, too smooth. Day 3 was colder. I checked the thermometer I'd hung outside. 19 degrees. The clouds hadn't moved all morning. The trees didn't sway. Everything felt fixed, like the land was holding its breath. I walked out to the stream to refill my water jugs. Snow clung to the banks, and the water moved slow. About halfway back, I noticed something wrong with the trail. It had snowed lightly during the night, but my boot prints from yesterday were still visible, and something else was, too. Something that had stepped beside my prints, but never over them. The tracks were longer than mine, narrower too. Bare feet. That stopped me cold. Who the hell walks barefoot out here in 19 degrees? I followed the tracks for maybe 15 feet before they cut into the trees and vanished. No drag marks, no animal trails. Just gone. That night I stayed up. I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat in the corner of the cabin, rifle across my lap, the stove crackling behind me. Every so often, I thought I heard soft thumps outside, but they never came close. Still, I didn't move until sunrise. By day 4, I was thinking about leaving. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the world had gone hollow. I packed some of my gear into the Jeep, but I hadn't made up my mind. I wanted to believe I was just wound tight from being alone, that I was making things up. But something was wrong here. I couldn't deny that anymore. That afternoon, I took a short hike to the ridge behind the cabin. There was a good view from up there, and I thought I might see animal trails or maybe another cabin in the distance. But when I reached the top, I saw something I still have trouble explaining. On the opposite ridge, maybe 300 yards across, was a figure. Thin, tall, not wearing anything that I could see, just standing dead still between 2 trees. It didn't move. I looked at it for maybe 2 minutes, thinking it could be a tree stump, a dead snag, something explainable. But when I blinked, it was gone. I don't mean it ran. I mean it was there and then it wasn't. I backed down the trail quicker than I'd like to admit, slipping twice on patches of ice. My rifle was slung across my back, but my hands shook too much to even hold it. I didn't look behind me until I reached the cabin. Night 4 was the worst. Around 1 in the morning, I heard tapping on the wall behind my cot. Just 3 soft knocks, then silence. 10 minutes later, same thing. 3 knocks, this time on the opposite wall. I moved into the center of the cabin with the rifle. I didn't speak. I didn't move except to breathe. I could hear my own heart thudding in my ears. 2, I heard the front doorknob rattle. Not hard, just a slow twist like someone testing it. I hadn't locked it with a deadbolt, just the hook latch. I sat facing the door until morning light started to creep in around the windows. When I opened the door, there were footprints in the snow. Bare feet again. They led from the woods, stopped at my door, and went back the way they came.
No deviación.
No signs of hesitation, just a straight path. I knew then that if I didn't leave, something was going to happen. I packed everything, threw it all into the Jeep in under 20 minutes. I didn't even check the back trail for snow conditions. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was almost halfway to Grand Junction. When I finally found a gas station with a payphone, I called that guy from work and asked about his uncle's friend, the one who owned the cabin. He hesitated a little, then said he didn't know the full story, but that the cabin had been off limits for a while because of something that happened a few years back. Something about a hunter who went missing up there. No one ever found a body, just his truck still parked beside the cabin and some weird signs in the woods. The uncle didn't like talking about it, said the land wasn't right. I didn't ask for more. I didn't want more. I never went back to that part of the state again. I quit my job the following spring and moved to Oregon. Different mountains, different trees, but the woods never felt the same. Sometimes, I still wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the snow. Not in reality, but in my mind. That sound lives somewhere in me now, like it left its imprint on my nerves. And every now and then, I'll be hiking and see a stump or a tall rock and freeze, heart racing, thinking it's something watching me. I know what people say when I tell them parts of this. They think I imagined it, that I was sleep deprived, that isolation made my mind twist things around. And maybe they're right about some of that. But I saw those footprints. I saw the thing on the ridge. And I know what I heard. No ghost stories.
No curses.
Just something out there. Something real, something that still walks. Whatever it wasn't human. But it knew how to pretend. And that's what scared me the most. It was the kind of night that felt like the world was just a little bit off. The rain had been falling all day, thick, heavy sheets of water drenching the cabin and the surrounding forest. The trees, so thick and close together, seemed to press in on me, their branches groaning under the weight of the water. Felt like the entire world was closing in around the cabin. I'd always loved the cabin, though. It was small but cozy, tucked away on a piece of property I'd inherited from an old uncle. He'd passed away a few years ago, leaving it to me without much explanation. A lot of people would have sold it, but there was something about it that made me feel like I had to keep it. Maybe it was the history behind it, or the peaceful isolation it offered, away from the noise and distractions of the city. I wasn't alone in the cabin. Max, my dog, was with me. He was a big, old German shepherd, his coat thick and graying around the muzzle. He wasn't as spry as he used to be, but he still had the strength and intelligence that had made him such a great companion over the years. He was lying near the fireplace, his head resting on his paws as he watched me from across the room. The flickering flames reflected in his tired eyes, giving him an almost ghostly appearance. But Max had always been a good dog, and I trusted him. The rain beat heavily against the roof, loud enough to drown out any other sound. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, but that was nothing new. The cabin had its quirks, creaky floorboards, a leaky roof, and old windows that never quite closed properly. But that was part of its charm. There was nothing like the sound of the storm outside while you were safe and dry inside, especially with Max curled up by the fire. But tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the storm, it was too quiet. Max, normally so alert, hadn't moved an inch since we'd settled in for the evening. His ears were flat against his head, his gaze fixed on the door, his body tense. He was always aware of his surroundings, and I had learned over the years to trust his instincts. If Max was on edge, there was a reason. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I hadn't been up here in a while, and the solitude could get to anyone. Still, the air felt heavier than usual, like something was waiting, just out of sight. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth didn't seem to reach me. Max shifted suddenly, standing up and moving toward the door. I watched him, confused. He wasn't the type to get up unless something was wrong. I called him back, but he didn't listen. He stood by the door, his nose twitching as if he could smell something. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stood up, my boots creaking on the old wooden floor. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. I approached Max, who was now staring intently at the door, his body tense and rigid. I knelt down beside him, scratching behind his ears, but he didn't relax. His gaze never left the door. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. My heart began to race. There was no reason for anyone to be out here in the middle of a storm. The cabin was miles away from the nearest road, and the forest around it was thick and nearly impassable. But the sense of unease only deepened as I stood there, staring at the door. Suddenly, a noise. It was faint at first, barely audible above the storm. A soft rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. Max growled low in his throat, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew that growl. It was the kind he only made when something wasn't right, when someone or something was too close. I reached for the door, my hand trembling slightly as I grasped the handle. Max was already beside me, his body blocking the door as if he were trying to shield me. I could hear it now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel just outside. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't open the door. There was no reason to. The storm was too fierce for anyone to be out there. But the footsteps persisted, moving around the cabin, as though someone was circling it, trying to get inside. My mind raced. Who would be out there? The thought of someone in the woods at this hour, in this weather, seemed impossible. Max let out a soft whine, his tail tucked between his legs. He was scared, I could tell, and that scared me more than anything. Max had faced down bigger threats before, wild animals, strangers in the woods, even a few close calls with poachers. But this was different. I glanced out the window, my flashlight sweeping over the rain-soaked trees. The beam caught nothing but shadows and movement in the wind. There was no sign of anyone, but the footsteps continued, steady and slow. It was as if whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. I backed away from the door, heart racing. I checked the locks on the windows and made sure the heavy curtains were drawn. Max stayed close to me, his low growl never stopping. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of my mind told me that I was overreacting, that it was just some animal or even the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. The presence of someone else, something else outside the cabin. Time passed in a blur of tension and paranoia. The footsteps around the cabin stopped for a moment, and I dared to breathe a little easier. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft scraping sound. It came from the side of the cabin where the back door was. The sound of something or someone trying to open it. I turned to Max, my hand on his back. He was shaking, his body rigid, his eyes wide with fear. He knew it wasn't an animal. He knew it was something far worse. I grabbed the old hunting rifle that I kept near the fireplace. It was loaded, ready to go. My hands were steady now, adrenaline and fear mixing together as I approached the back door. The scraping sound stopped, replaced by a low, deliberate knock. 3 slow knocks, as if whoever it was knew I was inside, knew I was listening. Max barked, the sound sharp and sudden. I didn't waste any more time. I pulled the door open just enough to see outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the rain, landing on the ground and revealing the muddy footprints leading up to the door. But no one was there, just empty space. I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The footprints were too fresh. The mud was still damp from the rain, and there were no signs of anyone leaving. The only thing I could hear now was the pounding of the rain and the frantic beat of my own heart. Max barked again, this time louder, more urgent. I stepped outside, scanning the area with the flashlight, my breath coming in short gasps. Nothing. The woods around me were silent, save for the storm. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow, quick and fleeting, just beyond the trees. My blood ran cold. I turned the flashlight in its direction, but by the time the beam landed, there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. Max growled again, his voice deep and ominous. I didn't hesitate. I called for him to follow me, and together we retreated back inside the cabin. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. The sound of the rain against the roof seemed to fill the cabin, drowning out everything else. I sat in front of the fire, Max at my feet, and waited. The night passed slowly. The rain didn't let up, but neither did the feeling of being watched. I stayed alert, my senses on high, the rifle close at hand. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, made my heart race. But no one came. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy fog. The woods outside were quiet again, the only sound the occasional drip of water from the trees. The footprints around the cabin had been washed away by the rain, leaving nothing behind but the soft, muddy earth. Max and I stayed the night in the cabin, but we left the next morning. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I couldn't risk staying there any longer. It was too much, too real. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know this. Whatever it was, it never came inside. Max and I made it through the night, and as we drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I'd escaped something terrible, and I wasn't planning on going back anytime soon. It had been a long week. Work had piled up, and I was just looking for an escape. That's when I got the idea. A weekend alone in the woods, far away from everything. A friend of mine, Luke, had mentioned a cabin his uncle owned, out in the middle of nowhere, far enough from town to not even be on the map. It sounded like the perfect retreat. I was 32, living in a small town where everyone knew each other. It was easy to get caught up in the routine, and it seemed like a trip like this could reset everything. After a bit of convincing, Luke sent me the details. A small, run-down cabin about 3 hours outside of town, tucked deep in a forest. He warned me it was old and barely used, but I wasn't concerned. I was tired of the noise and wanted quiet, something peaceful. I packed up my car, threw in some food, a few bottles of water, and a flashlight, and set off early Friday morning. The drive was smooth, and the further I got, the less I saw other cars. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started to dip low, casting a golden hue over the thick forest that surrounded me. The cabin was nothing special at first glance. It looked like something out of a movie, a small, weathered structure with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was chipped, the windows were old, and the front door hung crooked, but there was something oddly comforting about it. It was isolated just as I'd hoped. I unloaded my stuff and took a quick tour inside. The cabin had 2 rooms, one large living space with a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area with a table. The bathroom was tiny, and the water had a distinct smell to it, but it worked. I set my things down, lit a fire, and cooked some food. It was perfect. The smell of burning wood, the crackling of the fire, it all felt right. Night came quickly. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, the forest was eerily still. Not a sound. No wind, no animals, not even a rustle of leaves. I thought it was strange, but figured it was just the isolation. Maybe I was getting paranoid. After a while, I got ready for bed. The cabin had a loft, and I set up my sleeping bag there. The air was cool, and the blankets felt warm, but something felt off. The quiet was so deep, so heavy, that it almost felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't peaceful. The feeling of being watched kept nagging at me. Every small creak of the wood, every crackle of the fire below, seemed louder than usual. I tried to shake it off, but the sensation wouldn't go away. The next day, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows through the trees. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, so I headed into the woods with no particular destination. I had read a bit about the area before coming. It was supposed to be a haven for wildlife and a good place to hike. The trees were tall and the path I followed was narrow, overgrown in spots but still visible. It was quiet again, the kind of silence you rarely find in busy places, where every step you take seems to echo in your ears. I walked for a good hour, just taking in the sights and sounds of the forest. The farther I went, the more the path seemed to narrow, eventually becoming little more than a trail carved into the dirt. The trees here were older, their bark gnarled and thick, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky. Eventually, I found myself standing near a clearing, a small, open patch in the middle of the woods. In the center of the clearing was an old, rusted truck, half buried under vines and moss. It looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. The metal was dented and corroded, and the tires were long gone, leaving only the skeleton of the vehicle behind. It was strange to find something like this so deep in the woods, but as I looked around, I noticed something even stranger. A small mound of earth near the truck. I approached it cautiously. The ground around the mound was disturbed, like something had been dug up recently. My heart began to race. I bent down and reached for the dirt. Something sharp jabbed my fingers. I quickly pulled my hand back and realized it was a bone. The unsettling thought hit me. What was buried here? I backed away from the mound, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone living out here? Had someone else been to this place? I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. The uneasy feeling I had yesterday was starting to creep in again, and I didn't want to stick around longer than necessary. I made my way back along the trail, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't want to be followed. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, though I wasn't sure why. There was no reason to think anyone had followed me, but something about the forest felt off. I tried to shake the feeling and focused on getting a fire going again. Night came and the cabin felt even more isolated. I thought about what I'd found in the woods. Maybe it was just an old grave. Maybe the truck had belonged to someone who had died there years ago. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again. It was a distinct sound, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived, and I didn't expect anyone to be out here in the middle of nowhere. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, but I could still feel something. The air in the cabin felt heavier, colder, like the woods had somehow invaded my space. I grabbed the flashlight I had left by the side of the bed and slowly got up, trying to make as little noise as possible. I crept down the stairs, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Was I just being paranoid? I decided to look outside. As I opened the door, a chill ran down my spine. There, standing at the edge of the porch, was a man. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the outline of his figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, and standing completely still, staring into the woods. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just an animal. I had no idea who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been there. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But there was no signal out here. I had no way of knowing how far the nearest station was. I was completely alone, stuck in this cabin, with no way to get help. I didn't want to confront him. I slowly shut the door and backed away, my mind racing. Should I leave? Should I wait it out? The fear of the unknown, of what could happen, was overwhelming. Then, just as quickly as the man appeared, he was gone. The silence returned, and I stood there in the dark, unsure if I had just imagined the whole thing. But I didn't think I had. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any more sounds, but nothing came. The man didn't return. The morning light brought some relief, but the feeling of dread lingered. I packed my things and decided it was time to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me, but I couldn't figure out why. As I drove away from the cabin, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the woods. When I got back to town, I spoke with Luke. He seemed surprised that I had such an uneasy experience, but when I mentioned the truck and the strange mound, his face changed. "That truck's been there for years," he said. "It's a local legend, actually. People say it was part of a murder-suicide from back in the 80s. No one really knows what happened, but it was never solved." My stomach dropped. The unease that had followed me from the cabin suddenly made sense. I wasn't alone in the woods after all. Something about that place, the truck, the mound, felt like a warning, and I had ignored it. As I left Luke's place, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, only the quiet and the reminder that sometimes, when you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. I was looking forward to this trip. My friends had warned me about the isolation, but that was part of the charm. A weekend in a cabin, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service, no distractions, just me, nature, and the stillness I'd been craving. I needed to disconnect, to recharge, and this cabin, tucked away in a remote part of North Carolina, seemed like the perfect place to do it. I had rented the place through an old family friend of mine, a guy named Earl who'd been running a small business renting out these cabins for years. He told me the area was quiet, peaceful even, and that I'd find a great sense of solitude. I was in my mid-30s, a tech guy by trade, and I'd never been one to shy away from solitude. The occasional hike, the stillness of the woods, it was a part of my routine. But this time I wanted more. I needed to unplug. The drive was longer than expected, mostly because of the winding dirt roads that led deeper into the mountains. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the chill of the evening air was settling in. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of being on my own at night, with only the light of the moon and the glow of a fire to keep me company. The cabin itself was small, rustic, but it had everything I needed. A wood stove, a small kitchenette, a comfy bed, and a big front porch that looked out into the dense woods. There was a small stream nearby, just barely visible in the fading light. It was quiet, almost eerily so, but that was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my bags and set about starting a fire in the stove. The crackling warmth filled the room as I opened a bottle of whiskey I'd brought along. I didn't have a specific plan for the weekend. Maybe a bit of hiking, some reading, and plenty of time to think. That night, I went to bed early, enjoying the stillness. The woods outside were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of a breeze. But something about the silence made me uneasy. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the isolation, and tried to push it aside. The first morning was beautiful. I woke up early to the soft light of dawn creeping through the cabin's windows. After a quick breakfast, I decided to take a walk down to the stream. I grabbed my jacket and left the cabin, eager to get moving, to stretch my legs after the long drive. The path to the stream was a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The air was cool, crisp, and the only sounds were the occasional snap of twigs underfoot and the distant chirping of birds. The stream itself was small but crystal clear, babbling over rocks and weaving through the woods. I stopped for a moment, letting the peacefulness of the scene wash over me. I leaned down to take a drink from the stream, cupping my hands to catch the cold water. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves, the sound of someone walking, not far off. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. I stood up, listening carefully. My heart rate quickened, a subtle shift in my chest. There was no reason to be alarmed. It could have been anyone, right? Someone out for a walk, maybe another cabin goer nearby. But I was alone out here, or so I thought. The woods were quiet again, almost too quiet. The footsteps stopped, as if the person had heard me too. I decided to head back to the cabin, walking briskly, trying to convince myself it was nothing. It was probably someone from one of the other cabins, I reasoned, or maybe even Earl checking on me. But as I made my way back down the trail, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that unnerved me. It was the sudden stillness. There was no breeze, no birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching on the dirt, my thoughts racing. I reached the cabin, locked the door behind me, and felt a wave of relief. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I saw him. I was sitting on the front porch, reading a book, when I noticed someone standing at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, a shadow moving in the wind. But no, it was a man, tall, unshaven, dressed in a worn-out flannel shirt and dark jeans. His eyes locked onto mine. I froze. I couldn't tell how long he'd been standing there, but it felt like ages. My pulse quickened. There was something off about him. He wasn't a hiker. He wasn't even the type of person I expected to see in these parts. His clothes were ragged, and his posture was tense, like a predator waiting for the right moment. I couldn't quite place it, but something felt wrong. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I wanted to call out to him, ask if he needed help, but my throat was dry. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. After what felt like forever, he finally turned and disappeared into the trees, without a word. I sat there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Maybe he was just passing through, I told myself. Maybe he was looking for something, or maybe I was overreacting. But my gut told me this wasn't normal. I spent the rest of the day inside, watching the woods from the cabin's windows, too paranoid to step outside. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, but I wasn't about to take any chances. As night fell, I made sure the cabin was locked up tight. I stayed up late that night, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every distant sound in the woods, made me tense up, straining my ears for any signs of movement. But nothing came. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something in me told me that staying would be a bad idea. I packed up my things, moved quickly through the motions, and drove down the winding dirt roads, eager to put the cabin and the man in the woods behind me. As I reached the main road, my phone buzzed. It was Earl. "Hey, Jake," he said. "I just wanted to check in. Everything okay out there?" I hesitated, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I had to ask. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just, is there anyone else up here? I thought I saw someone yesterday." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "No one should be there. There's no other cabins around for miles. It's just you out there." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Earl replied. "I'd know if anyone else was up there. Are you sure you're okay?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure about anything anymore. As I drove away, the thought of that man lingering in the woods stayed with me, creeping into the corners of my mind. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous never quite left. Maybe it was just an isolated encounter. Maybe he was just a lost soul passing through. But as I turned the car onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief second, just before the trees swallowed up the cabin, I thought I saw him again, standing in the woods watching me leave. The chill that ran down my spine didn't fade for days. The sun had dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it always did in early autumn, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. I stood at the edge of the dirt road leading to the park ranger's cabin, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, my boots caked in the mud of the trail I'd just come from. My name is Luke Harris, and I'd been working in the wilderness area for the past 3 months. The cabin I was assigned to was far off the beaten path, a 2-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. It was a secluded spot, perfect for keeping a low profile and making sure the forest stayed untouched by any human interference. The kind of place you'd expect to find nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. But as I approached the cabin, something felt off. The usual stillness of the woods was broken by the strange sense of unease that crept up my spine. The wind didn't seem to be blowing in quite the right direction, and the familiar chirp of crickets was absent. In its place, there was an unsettling quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling. After all, it was just a feeling. The woods had a way of playing tricks on you, especially when you were alone, as I often was. But the uneasy tension gnawed at me as I stepped up onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the cabin itself seemed to groan in the wind. The door, which should have been locked, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peering out from inside. My hand instinctively gripped the rifle slung across my back. I pushed the door open slowly, my boots scraping across the porch as I stepped inside. The smell of must and mildew hit me immediately. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dim light coming from the windows. The fireplace on the far wall had gone cold, and the place looked like no one had been there for days. The furniture was simple, just a table, a few chairs, and a small cot in the corner. The walls were adorned with a few maps and a collection of old hunting trophies. Nothing unusual, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I dropped my backpack on the floor by the door and took a quick look around. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the windows. They were all securely shut. The door had been locked when I left, so there was no way anyone could have gotten inside. But why was it open now? I walked to the back of the cabin and found the small wood stove that heated the place. There was no sign of a fire recently being lit. In fact, everything seemed colder than it should have been for this time of year. Something wasn't right. I stood there for a while, listening to the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet that comes with being out in the woods. This was a silence that felt wrong, like it had been manufactured somehow, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. I turned to leave, thinking maybe I'd just go back to the nearest town to report whatever strange feeling I had. But before I could reach the door, I heard something, a slight sound, the faintest rustling noise, coming from somewhere deep in the woods behind the cabin. I froze. It wasn't the wind. The trees were too still, their branches unmoving in the night air. No, this was something else, something human. My hand instinctively moved to my side, where my rifle was strapped. But I didn't draw it just yet. I listened closely, straining my ears, and then I heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. A twig snapped in the distance, followed by the low crunch of footsteps in the underbrush. I didn't move, my heart racing in my chest. Whoever was out there, they were trying to be quiet. Too quiet. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing else came. No other sounds, just the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed the rifle off my back, moving toward the door. I opened the door slowly, peering out into the dark. The faint light from the cabin barely cut through the pitch-black woods around me. I squinted into the darkness, looking for movement. Nothing. I stepped outside, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound of my boots crunching in the dirt felt deafening in the silence of the woods. I moved toward the tree line where the footsteps had been. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind. There was no one here, just the eerie quiet of the forest. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I took another step forward, my rifle held tight in my hands. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I knew that whatever it wasn't good. And then I saw it, a flash of movement in the trees, a shadow just barely visible in the moonlight. I didn't hesitate. I darted toward it, my rifle aimed straight ahead. But as I got closer, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the thick underbrush. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it, but the feeling didn't go away. It intensified, and with it, the sense that I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves overhead, but I could still feel it. The weight of eyes on me, hidden somewhere in the shadows. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its posture was stiff. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the outline of its body, just enough to know it was real. I didn't wait to see if it would make a move. I spun on my heel and bolted back toward the cabin. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs burning from the sprint. I reached the cabin in record time, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind raced. What had I just seen? I leaned against the door, trying to steady my nerves. I could still feel the weight of the figure in the woods, standing there waiting. But now there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the silence. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The solitude of the forest had a way of making you see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was out there, something dangerous. The next few hours were a blur of restlessness. I kept the rifle close, my eyes darting to every window, every creak of the cabin's old wooden frame. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again, standing just out of reach, its face hidden in the dark. By morning, I was exhausted but resolved. I wasn't staying here another night. I would make my way back to the park office, tell someone what I had seen, and get the hell out of there. I packed my things quickly, checking the cabin one last time before I left. But as I opened the door to leave, I froze. There, lying on the porch, was a small piece of paper. It was crumpled, as if it had been thrown there in a hurry. I bent down and unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was simple, written in shaky handwriting. "You should have left when you had the chance." I stood there, staring at the note, my mind racing. The figure in the woods hadn't been a hallucination. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching me, and they knew I was here. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the cabin. I didn't look back. The trail ahead seemed long, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I didn't tell anyone what happened out there. I didn't need to. The Park Service would have written it off as a freak occurrence, and honestly, I didn't want to know what was really out there. But I'd learned my lesson. There were things in the woods that didn't want to be found, and if you were unlucky enough to cross their path, they would make sure you knew it. As I walked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, and no matter how far I went, I would never forget the silence of that cabin, the shadows in the woods, and the feeling that something was waiting just out of sight. I had always been a person who found comfort in the solitude of nature. That's why, when I decided to take some time off from work, I chose a small, remote cabin in the countryside to clear my head. The year was 2018, and I was 32. The world outside was chaotic, and I needed an escape, something peaceful, something simple. A cabin tucked away in the woods seemed like the perfect place to disconnect, think, and reset. The cabin was located in a patch of forest on the outskirts of a small town, about 2 hours north of where I lived in the city. I'd rented it from a website that specialized in rural, isolated properties. The listing had painted it as a rustic but comfortable getaway. There were pictures of an old log cabin with a wood-burning stove, a fireplace, and views of untouched forests stretching for miles. I could already feel myself relaxing just thinking about it. I arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting an amber glow over the landscape. The air was cool, with the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft above it, but it looked cozy enough. A narrow dirt road led to it, and as I parked my car in front, I could already tell that the nearest neighbors were a good distance away. This was exactly what I wanted. I didn't waste any time unloading my bags, setting up my things inside. There was a simple charm about the place. A wood stove sat in the corner, a stack of dry firewood piled beside it. The loft above had a queen-sized bed with thick blankets, and a small table and chairs filled the rest of the space. Outside, a small porch overlooked a clearing in the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. It felt like I was the only person in the world. I spent the first night inside, reading a book by the fire. It was quiet. I could hear the occasional rustle of animals in the woods, but nothing more. The kind of quiet that made you feel both at ease and unnerved at the same time. By the time I went to bed, the darkness outside was complete. There was no street light, no sign of civilization. The silence was overwhelming. It felt like being alone on a different planet. The next morning, I decided to explore a little. I stepped out onto the porch and stretched, taking in the view of the dense trees that surrounded the cabin. The air was crisp and fresh, and there was a hint of frost on the ground from the night before. I decided to walk down the path that led away from the cabin, eager to see where it went. The woods were thick with trees, their trunks twisting upward like giant, gnarled hands reaching for the sky. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the cabin and the world outside slowly faded away. The only noise was the crunch of dried leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came to a small clearing with a stream running through it. The water was clear, and I knelt beside it, watching the ripples. The beauty of the place was undeniable. It was the kind of stillness I had been craving, but something felt off. It was a strange feeling, one I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that I hadn't seen anyone in days. There was a heavy silence, like the world was holding its breath. I spent the rest of the day wandering around the woods, taking in the scenery, and gathering firewood for the night. As the sun began to set again, I returned to the cabin, but this time, there was something different. The air felt colder, and I noticed that the woods around the cabin seemed quieter than before, almost unnervingly quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I kept the fire burning, the crackling flames filling the silence in the cabin. I tried to focus on my book, but my mind kept wandering. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the woods had felt, that strange feeling of being watched. I didn't want to overthink it. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. It was probably just my imagination. But then I heard it, a soft thud against the cabin wall. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I froze. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer knocking into the cabin by accident. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I waited for another sound, another sign, but the cabin was still, the silence almost deafening. I convinced myself to get some sleep, but I couldn't relax. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside, made my heart race. The hours passed slowly, and I eventually managed to fall into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the air thick with fog, the kind of fog that clung to everything, making the world look like it was smothered under a thick blanket. I could barely see beyond the edge of the porch, and the trees were lost in the mist. It was beautiful in a haunting way, but I had the same uneasy feeling from the night before. I decided to stay close to the cabin today, not venturing too far into the woods. I made a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, trying to shake the strange feeling I couldn't explain. But as the fog began to lift, I saw something. It was faint at first, barely noticeable in the distance. A figure standing between the trees just outside the clearing. It was hard to make out the details through the mist, but there was something about the way it stood that made me feel uncomfortable. It was too still, too silent. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, but as soon as the figure noticed me looking, it vanished into the woods. I blinked, unsure if I had really seen it, but the chill that ran down my spine told me that I had. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was someone else staying in the area, a hiker or a local, but there was something about the way it disappeared so quickly that made me think otherwise. The rest of the day passed without incident, but the feeling that I wasn't alone never left. The silence in the woods seemed to stretch on for longer than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. That night, I decided to leave the cabin early the next morning. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but something about the place was starting to get to me. It wasn't just the figure in the mist. It was the eerie stillness, the way everything felt just a little too quiet, a little too off. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and set out toward the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the cabin. Just a flicker, like someone stepping out of view. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The people there would have probably thought I was overreacting, but I knew what I'd experienced. There was something in that cabin, something in those woods, something that made me feel like I wasn't welcome. I don't know who or what I saw out there, but I never returned to that cabin. The place was too quiet, too still, and the longer I think about it, the more I realize that some things are better left unexplained. It was 2019. I was 38, divorced for 3 years. I'd been working odd jobs in a rural part of Washington, bouncing around between construction gigs and maintenance work, trying to stay out of people's way. That summer, a guy I'd met through a landscaping company told me about a cabin job up in the hills. Some guy from Seattle had bought land around Pateros and wanted a few seasonal workers to maintain the trails, clear out brush, and keep an eye on things through the fall. It sounded like just the kind of work I needed, remote, simple, and without much small talk. I signed on for 6 weeks. The drive up to the property was steep and winding. You wouldn't find it unless someone told you where it was. There were no signs, no markers, just a turnoff past a line of weather-worn trees. From there, a narrow dirt road led deep into the hills. The cabin itself was basic, not old but not new either. Just 4 walls, a roof, and a small deck overlooking a slope full of dry pines. It had a propane heater, a generator out back, and a well pump. I didn't mind that there was no cell signal. That was part of the appeal. There were 2 other guys working on the property, but we weren't staying in the same area. I had the cabin closest to the southern boundary, tucked into a stand of evergreens near the ridge. They gave me a truck to get around with and a chainsaw to manage fallen trees. The work wasn't hard. Most days, I just walked the perimeter, cut back brush, checked trail cams, and made sure nobody was camping where they shouldn't be. The land was big, over 1,000 acres, I was told. There were deer, foxes, and plenty of hawks, but nothing dangerous. Still, I carried a .22 for coyotes. I only saw one the whole time I was there, and it ran off fast. Most nights, I cooked on a single burner, drank a couple cans of cheap beer, and read by lantern light. It got cold quickly once the sun dipped. I liked it that way. It was quiet. I'd been up there about 2 weeks when things started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little stuff. I started noticing prints near the trails I'd cleared. At first, I figured they were mine, but the tread didn't match my boots. The ground up there is dry and powdery, so prints don't last long. You get a day or two before the wind brushes them out. These were fresh. They'd show up in the morning, near the trailhead or by the split log I'd cut and rolled off to the side. There were 3 distinct sets, one smaller than mine, one much larger, and one that looked like worn-out sneakers, thin-soled with no clear tread pattern. They never overlapped, but they were always close together, like someone walking slightly out of sync with 2 others. I didn't hear anyone. I didn't see anything, but I kept finding signs. Twigs snapped clean and low, little stacks of rocks along the side of the trail. Sometimes even bits of wire hung between trees like someone was trying to string a line or mark a path. I mentioned it once to the guy who dropped off fuel every few days. He was a younger guy named Sean, always blasting music from his truck. Never said more than he had to. He just shrugged when I brought it up and said maybe hikers wandered through. But the nearest public land was miles away, and this property wasn't easy to stumble onto by accident. I didn't sleep great that week. Something about the quiet started to feel too quiet. I kept the window cracked above the bed for airflow, and one night around 3 a.m., I heard crunching out near the pump shed. At first, I thought it was a deer, but deer are fast and light. This was slower, heavier. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and waited. It stopped before I opened the door, and when I finally stepped out, there was nothing, just the hum of the generator and the cold night air. But in the morning, I saw it again, prints. This time, they led around the back of the shed where the pump lines ran. The strange part was they didn't come from the trail. They came from the tree line behind the cabin, the thickest part of the woods. I followed them for about 20 yards before they faded into the pine needles. Something was watching the place. I started locking the door during the day, which I hadn't done before. Every time I went out for work, I'd check over my shoulder more than I liked. The feeling wasn't fear exactly, it was pressure, like being stared at for too long. I'd walk half a mile out, cut deadfall, turn back, and feel it. I was somewhere waiting. For days later, I came back to the cabin after dusk. The door was shut, locked like I'd left it, but inside something felt wrong. I keep things a certain way. My hat always goes on the hook, boots by the mat, tools under the bench. That night, the hat was on the bench, the boots were off angle, and one of my gloves was gone. Just one. I looked everywhere, thought maybe I dropped it in the truck or left it out back. It never turned up. The next day, I built a small tripwire rig with a bell on the front step. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I had to sleep at some point. I started keeping the rifle close, too. I left the generator off that night and used the lantern instead, just to make less noise. I figured if someone was out there, they'd have to walk right up to the deck to get a good look inside. Around midnight, the bell rang. Not loud, just a light jingle. I sat up in bed, heart racing. Didn't move. Waited. I knew the wind couldn't set it off. I strung it low and tight. Something had touched it. I didn't go to the window. I just waited in the dark, holding the rifle, listening. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard footsteps. Not many, just 3 or 4 slow crunches on the gravel path. Then silence again. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I found nothing. The bell was still there. No prints. Nothing moved or stolen. just the same strange silence. That day, I hiked out to the northern boundary to check the trail cams. There were two that I hadn't checked in over a week. Both were mounted up high, one facing a narrow path, the other watching an old, rusted gate we never used. The batteries were fine. I brought a viewer and scrolled through the memory. Deer, more deer, a fox, and then someone walking. It was just a few frames. The angle was poor, but it was clearly a person, wearing dark clothes, head down, arms at their sides. They walked past the camera and vanished behind a stump. A full-grown adult by the look of it. But here's the strange part. There was no timestamp for that frame. Just a blank mark. All the others were dated. That one frame was glitched, like the camera hesitated or didn't want to log it. I checked the second camera. Same thing. Someone walked across it around the same time. Head down, same clothes. But they stopped for a second, turned toward the camera, and smiled. Not a normal smile. Their lips were shut, and their face didn't show happiness. It was the kind of smile someone makes when they know something you don't. That night, I took both cameras down. I didn't tell anyone. The final week was the worst. I stayed close to the cabin, made fake trails, laid out sticks in deliberate patterns, tried to catch whoever it was moving through. But nothing changed. I never saw them again. Not in daylight, but at night they got closer. The bell rang twice the next night. I stayed still again. I heard soft breathing outside the wall. Then it stopped. I waited for the sun. At dawn, I found the glove I'd lost. It was folded and left on the deck railing. That same day, I found the smallest set of prints again, leading toward the dry creek. They stopped at a thicket of brush, and I saw something stuck in the branches. It was a strip of cloth, tan, faded, torn from something, maybe a jacket. I burned it. I didn't leave the cabin that night. I filled the generator tank, pulled the curtains, and sat by the door with the rifle in my lap. I didn't light anything. No lantern, no stove. Just sat in the dark. Sometime after midnight, I heard something scrape along the far wall, long drawn out, like someone dragging metal or stone across the wood. It lasted 10 seconds. Then it was silent. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found 3 marks etched into the siding. Deep gouges, like from a screwdriver or old knife. They weren't random, they were straight and deliberate, about a foot apart, slashed downward. That was enough. I packed what I could into the truck, left the rest behind, and drove down the trail without looking back. I didn't even radio the others. I just left. I called the guy in charge from town and told him there was something wrong with the southern perimeter. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. He mailed me my last paycheck 2 weeks later. I never went back. A few months after that, I was working nights at a warehouse near Yakima. Got a call from Sean, the guy who used to drop off supplies. He sounded different, nervous. Told me the guy who bought the land was shutting it down. Too many trespassers, he said. Things going missing. Trail cams smashed. One of the workers quit after finding a dead rabbit nailed to his door. Another one claimed someone had left a note on his truck windshield that said, "Stop watching." That land was sold off the next year. I still think about those nights sometimes. The bell, the footprints, the scratches. That face on the trail cam. It was real. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and for whatever reason, they wanted me to know it. I was 36 when I took a week off work in late September of 2019. My job as a logistics coordinator in a warehouse outside Des Moines, Iowa had worn me thin. Between long hours, a bad shoulder from years of lifting pallets, and a recent breakup, I needed a change of scenery. A friend had mentioned a few times about a remote area in northern Minnesota where his cousin owned some property. Forested, quiet, far off the grid. Apparently, there was an old cabin up there, abandoned for years. The cousin used to hunt in that area, but hadn't been back in a decade. I got the GPS coordinates, threw my camping gear in the back of my Toyota Tacoma, and made the 10-hour drive north. The drive was long, and once I left the last stretch of blacktop highway, the back roads got rough. At first it was gravel, then eventually a mess of dirt and stone with deep ruts carved by rain and old tires. It wasn't on any map. I followed the GPS as far as it would go, and when the signal finally cut out, I kept going until I reached the spot where the trail stopped completely. It was late afternoon. I parked on the side of a clearing that overlooked a narrow valley full of pine and birch. There was no reception, no people, no sound but the wind. I strapped my pack on and walked for maybe a half mile through a thinning trail until I saw it. The cabin. It sat low, half sunk into the earth, as if the forest had started reclaiming it. The logs were gray and weathered. Moss ran up the sides, and the roof sagged but hadn't collapsed. There was a short stone chimney with a rusted-out stovepipe sticking crooked at the top. The windows were either boarded or caked with grime. A wooden door hung slightly open, creaking in the breeze. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, not just 10 years. Still, I stepped inside. The interior was cold and damp. Dust floated in the shafts of light that crept through cracks in the boards. There was a stone fireplace against the far wall, an old cot with a moth-eaten blanket, and a table with 2 chairs, one knocked over. Everything was layered in dirt and leaves. I could smell mildew, the kind that comes from long-forgotten places. I set my gear near the fireplace and stepped outside again to gather some wood. The sun was already dropping behind the trees. I stayed the first night without much trouble. I cooked a small meal over a portable burner, cracked a beer, and sat out under the stars with a fire going in front of the cabin. It was peaceful in that way that deep wilderness can be, both calming and slightly unnerving. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch, seemed amplified. I kept my knife close, not out of fear, but instinct. I was alone and many miles from help. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a dry creek bed about 200 yards to the east and what looked like the remains of a collapsed outhouse on the other side. I found rusted cans, some broken bottles, and the skeletal remains of what might have been a deer. At first, I thought it was a hunting camp, but there was no evidence of recent activity. Even the trails were barely visible under the leaves and moss. That afternoon, I started going through the cabin in more detail. The back wall had a strange bulge. The logs weren't aligned right. One section stuck out a few inches, and when I pressed on it, the wood gave a little. It wasn't rot, it was hollow. I knocked. A deep thud came back. I searched the cabin for any kind of tool. Behind the fireplace, I found an old axe head, just the head, no handle, and used it to chip away at the wall. After a few minutes, a board cracked. Behind it was a narrow door, nailed shut and flush with the inside.
No knob.
No hinges on this side, just a slab of wood jammed in with rusted nails. I stood there for a long time staring at it. Why would someone board up a room from the inside of the house? Eventually, I pried the nails out one by one and pulled the door loose. It was a closet or a pantry, maybe 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Shelves lined the walls, full of old jars and cans. Most were rusted shut or moldy. But in the corner, there was something strange. A wooden box, maybe 2 feet long, closed, padlocked. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. I shook it gently. No sound. Back at the table, I tried to force the lock but couldn't. I was about to give up when I remembered the small pry bar I kept in my truck. I walked the half-mile back through the trees, got it, and returned with a flashlight just in case it got dark. It took about 15 minutes, but eventually, the lock snapped off. I opened the box. Inside, wrapped in an oily canvas, were a stack of notebooks and several rolls of film in metal canisters. The notebooks were old, thin pages yellowed with age, the writing cramped and neat. The covers were labeled with dates from the early 80s. I opened the first one. Most of the writing was in a kind of shorthand. Some of it was easy to follow, mentions of hunting, the weather, tracking deer, setting traps. But after a few pages, the tone shifted. There were mentions of people, not names, just numbers. Caught another one near the old fence line. Young, maybe 16. That sentence stopped me cold. I kept reading, didn't scream, took a while to bleed out. I closed the notebook. I was suddenly very aware of how far I was from anyone. I stood up, paced the room, looked out the slats in the boarded window. The woods seemed to press in. Every sound made me jump. I opened a second notebook. It was more of the same. Descriptions of people, injuries, dates, and strange codes. The entries became more frenzied toward the end. The last page just had one line. Too many bones under the floor. Can't bury anymore. I sat there in silence, the notebook in my hands. My skin felt cold. I checked the floor beneath the table. Nothing unusual. I tapped around with the butt of my flashlight until I heard a slight echo near the fireplace. There was a hatch. The wood panel was slightly raised in one corner. I got down on my knees and pulled at it. Creaked open. Beneath was a small pit, no more than 4 feet deep. Dirt floor, wooden beams holding up the sides, and bones. So many bones. Some animal, but some definitely not. I didn't stay the night. I packed what I could and left everything else. I didn't care about my gear. I jogged back to the truck, heart pounding, the notebook still in my hand. The woods felt darker now, tighter, like they'd changed. The trail out felt longer. I didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station 5 hours south. There was reception again. I called the sheriff's department in Cook County and gave a vague tip about finding something suspicious near a cabin in the woods. I didn't leave my name. Back home, I tried to forget about it. I tossed the notebook in a storage bin in my garage. Weeks passed. Then someone knocked on my door. 2 men, suits, federal badges. They asked about my trip, how I found the cabin, what I took, what I saw. I told them the truth, more or less. They took the notebook. A week later, they contacted me again and told me the property had been under quiet investigation for a long time. A cold case task force had linked the area to several missing persons from the late 70s through the early 90s. All teens and young adults. The man who had lived in the cabin had never been found. His name wasn't public, but they showed me a photo. Gray hair, sunken eyes, sharp nose. I didn't recognize him. They told me I was lucky. I never went back. But sometimes at night I think about that box, about how many notebooks there were, and how one of the rolls of film was missing. Maybe he was still out there. But more than that, I kept remembering one line from the journal I couldn't get out of my head. Sometimes they scream, sometimes they don't. The quiet ones are worse. I never told anyone else about what I found. I didn't want the attention. I didn't want the questions. And I didn't want to think about what else might be buried out there, beneath that rotting wood and moss, in a cabin forgotten by time. It was October 2016 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 34 at the time, living in a flat in Sheffield, working as a freelance graphic designer. Life wasn't exactly bad, but it was getting loud in my head. I'd been buried in work for months and hadn't taken a proper break in over a year. My sleep was all over the place, and even small things started to feel overwhelming. I needed quiet, somewhere far, somewhere without people. I found this old cabin listed on a small independent website that advertised off-grid getaways across the UK. It was in Northumberland, near the edge of Kielder Forest. The photos showed a plain wooden cabin tucked into the trees with a small deck, a wood-burning stove, and solar panels for a bit of electricity. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, no TV. Just trees, a lake about 10 minutes down the slope, and a gravel road that barely passed as a driveway. Sounded perfect. The place was owned by an older couple, the Altons, who lived about 10 miles down the road in a small farmhouse. They handled the key handoff, but apart from that, they left guests alone. That was the whole appeal, apparently. I booked it for 2 weeks, packed the car with supplies, and left early on a Monday morning. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping behind the trees. The last bit of road leading up to the cabin was rough, just wide enough for one car, and full of potholes and roots. When I pulled up, the cabin looked just like the pictures, old but solid, with a low roof and wide windows facing the forest. It was quiet. I turned off the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening. No cars, no voices, no buzzing from city lights. Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the old wood around me. I felt the tension in my chest ease up. Inside, it was simple: wood floors, a small kitchen, a bathroom with an old but working water tank, a single bedroom, and a living area with a stone fireplace and some shelves of dusty books. Everything smelled like dry pine and burnt firewood. I unpacked my food, lit the fire, and settled in. The first few days were peaceful. I spent most of my time reading, cooking, and going for short walks along the edge of the forest. The lake was calm and empty, and the leaves had started to turn orange and red. At night, I'd sit out on the deck with a blanket, staring into the dark trees, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. I didn't see a single person, not a hiker, not a car, not even another cabin light through the trees. It was like the forest had swallowed me whole. It was on the fourth night that things changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. I stayed in bed, listening. The cabin walls were thin, and when everything else was quiet, even a squirrel on the deck sounded loud. But this wasn't fast or erratic like an animal. It was slower, steadier, footsteps, light, deliberate footsteps on the gravel outside. I sat up in bed and held my breath. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a dim flicker across the room. I waited, straining my ears. The footsteps crunched closer, then stopped. Nothing for a long while. Then I heard the faintest creak, the wood plank on the porch. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, my chest tight. I hadn't locked the door. I had meant to, but out here it didn't feel necessary. I grabbed the small hatchet I'd used for splitting firewood and crept out of the bedroom. I stood by the door for what felt like hours, listening. No more footsteps.
No knock.
No sound at all. Eventually, I opened the door fast, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing, just the cold night and the faint rustle of leaves. I stepped out onto the porch. The gravel path was empty. I scanned the trees, but saw no one. I told myself maybe it had been an animal after all, or my half-sleeping brain. But from that night on, I started locking the door, and I kept the hatchet by my bed. The next day was cloudy. I tried to distract myself, cooking a bigger breakfast than usual, going for a longer walk toward the lake, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, like it was holding something in. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. Footprints in the muddy part of the trail, larger than mine, older-looking boots walking the opposite direction. I hadn't passed anyone. No one else was supposed to be out here. That evening, just before sunset, I was chopping some firewood when I saw something move through the trees. I turned fast, and for a second, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But then I saw her, a woman, pale skin, long dark coat, thin build, standing maybe 30 feet into the trees. She wasn't walking or doing anything, just standing, staring. I stood still. I didn't know what to do. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stared. Her hair was messy, long and tangled. Her face was hard to see clearly in the low light, but something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't surprise or anger, it was blank. No expression at all. After maybe 30 seconds, she turned and walked away through the trees. I went inside and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the image of her in my head. Something was wrong about her, about the way she had just stood there. I didn't know if she was lost or living off the grid or watching me. I thought about leaving the next morning, but something stubborn in me resisted. I had come out here to get space, and I wasn't gonna run because someone happened to be walking through the woods. That's what I told myself, anyway. The next day, I walked the trail where I had seen her. There were no signs.
No footprints. No markings.
But I felt watched. I kept catching shadows in the corner of my eye. Trees that didn't feel like just trees. Every snap of a twig made me freeze. That night, just after midnight, I heard the gravel again. I didn't wait this time. I slipped on my jacket, grabbed the hatchet, and stood by the window, peeking through the corner of the curtain. For a while, nothing. Then, just barely visible under the pale light of the moon, I saw movement. She was standing by the edge of the trees again, this time closer, maybe 20 feet from the cabin, still staring. I watched her for 5 minutes. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't seem afraid, just cold, blank. Eventually, she walked off again. This became a pattern. Every night after that, she came back. Always the same time, always the same distance, never any closer, just standing there. By the 8th day, I was rattled. My hands shook when I tried to light the stove. I kept looking out the window. I moved furniture in front of the door at night. I stopped going on walks. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I didn't feel safe inside it either. It was like the woods had closed in, and I was trapped in the center. On the 9th night, she got closer. I woke up to the sound of her footsteps again. But this time, they didn't stop at the gravel. They came up the porch steps. I could hear her breathing. I stayed still in bed, not even daring to blink. My heart was pounding in my ears. She stayed there, just outside the door, for what felt like forever. Then the doorknob moved, just a slight rattle. She didn't try to force it open, just tested it. She left after that. No footsteps going back down, just silence. The next morning, I packed everything. I shoved food, books, clothes into bags and threw them in the back of the car. I didn't care about the 2 days I had left. I just wanted out. I drove straight to the Altons farmhouse and left the key in their mailbox with a note that just said, "Left early, sorry." Then I got back on the road and didn't stop until I hit a proper motorway. Took me weeks to calm down after that. For a while, I couldn't sleep without checking the windows 3 or 4 times. I kept imagining that face outside the glass, watching, just waiting. I never reported it. What would I say? That a woman kept showing up near the cabin and staring at me? That she rattled the doorknob one night? It wasn't a crime, technically, but it felt like one. A year later, out of some weird curiosity, I went back to that website to see if the cabin was still listed. It wasn't. The whole site was gone. I looked up the Altons. Couldn't find any trace of them. No property listing. No public record. It was like the whole thing had been scrubbed. I still think about her sometimes. That blank face in the trees. That silent shape just outside the cabin. I don't go into the woods anymore, and I never leave my door unlocked. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything. The year was 2017. I'd just gotten out of a 6-year relationship. My job in Birmingham was grinding me down, and the noise of city life had started to feel like a jackhammer on my skull. I worked in construction management and spent most of my time hunched over blueprints or dealing with suppliers who could never deliver anything on time. Nothing major had happened to push me over the edge, but a string of small things built up. I remember standing in line at the petrol station one night, staring blankly at the gum display, and I just knew I needed to get out. Not for a weekend, not for a week. I needed to vanish for a while. No one calling, no one texting, no responsibilities. So I booked time off, told my manager I needed a break to get my head straight. He was one of those guys who respected honesty, so he nodded and signed the leave request without saying much. I packed some essentials in the boot of my car, grabbed my boots, a thick jacket, a torch, a few knives, and a couple of camping tools. I wasn't aiming to go completely off-grid. I just wanted somewhere quiet, isolated, and with no mobile signal. I wasn't expecting to find the cabin. It was in a part of rural Northumberland I'd never visited before. I wasn't following a plan. I was just driving, staying off the motorways, choosing left turns instead of rights, following back roads and gravel paths. After a while, I stopped using the sat-nav. It didn't matter where I was going, only that I wasn't where I'd been. I saw the sign one morning after sleeping in my car on a forestry trail. It was a rusty old metal board, bent at the corners, leaning into the trees. It said, Harper's Grove, Cemetery Access. An arrow pointed down a muddy lane flanked by tall pine. Something about it drew me in. It was early autumn, still green, but with that cold bite in the morning air that hints at frost. The kind of air that wakes you up before you've had a sip of coffee. The lane was rough, all loose gravel and potholes. I slowed to a crawl, letting the tires ease over the rocks. It wound deeper into the woods for about 15 minutes, then opened up into a clearing. And there it was, the cabin. It sat off to the right, about 100 feet from an old graveyard surrounded by a low stone wall. The cabin looked like it had been built sometime in the 60s, maybe earlier. It was all dark timber with a tin roof that looked like it had been patched a dozen times over. There was a front porch with a swing seat hanging by one good chain and one that looked like it was barely clinging on. The windows were dusty but intact. No glass missing. The door was shut, but there was no lock I could see. It didn't feel abandoned, not entirely, but there were no fresh signs of life either. No footprints, no tire marks, just a quiet space, tucked deep into the trees, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. I parked the car, killed the engine, and stepped out. The only sound was the wind in the branches and the distant call of birds. The graveyard looked old, really old. The headstones were crooked and sunken, some so worn that the names were nothing but faint impressions. Most of the graves had weeds crawling over them. I walked along the edge of the wall, scanning the dates. 1874, 1890, 1903. The most recent one I could find was 1978, and even that one was cracked in two with moss blooming from the middle. The cabin door wasn't locked, creaked when I pushed it open. Inside was a single room with a small wood-burning stove in the corner, a metal-framed bed with a bare mattress, and a table with 2 chairs. Dust lay thick over everything, but not impossibly so. There were old tin cups still sitting on the table and a chipped kettle near the stove. No electricity, but someone had once tried to rig up some solar wiring on the back window. It didn't work anymore. I figured someone used to come up here now and then. Maybe not in years, maybe just during certain seasons. The air inside smelled of timber and cold ash, but nothing foul, nothing alive either. I walked around slowly, touching the table, lifting a chair, testing the bed. Everything held. Felt like a place that wanted to be used. I decided I'd stay a night, maybe 2. I swept the floor with an old broom I found behind the door, aired out the mattress, unrolled my sleeping bag, and settled in. That first night was the best sleep I'd had in months. The graveyard made me uneasy, though, not in a superstitious way. More the way it reminded me how forgotten people can become. Whoever was buried there had been gone for decades, and no one had come to see them. No flowers, no candles, just wind and moss. The more I looked at it, the more I started thinking about time and how quickly it all moves. That kind of thinking can mess with your head when you're alone in the woods. On the third day, I started noticing things. Small, almost nothing things. The swing on the porch would move at night, even when the air was still. I thought it was just my imagination until I checked it one morning and saw the dirt beneath the left chain was freshly disturbed, like something heavy had landed on it. The grave nearest the cabin had a fresh scratch down the stone, like someone had dragged a key across it. I tried to rationalize it. Could have been an animal, could have been wear and tear, but it didn't sit right. Then there was the knock. It was around 4 in the morning on the 5th day. I'd been sleeping light because I'd heard something outside the night before, a snapping twig, the rustle of something heavy just beyond the trees. So when I heard the knock, one solid thump on the side of the cabin, I sat straight up. It wasn't the door. It was the wall, maybe 4 feet from where my head was. I grabbed my torch, turned it on, and swept the beam across the room. Nothing inside. I stood, stepped toward the window, and angled the light out. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not trainers, bare feet, human from what I could tell. A dozen prints leading from the edge of the woods to the wall and then vanishing back the way they came. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and the prints were fresh. The size looked small, smaller than mine, almost like a teenager's. I didn't sleep after that. I waited, torch in one hand, knife in the other, until the sun broke through the trees. I told myself I'd leave, but I didn't. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe I was sleepwalking, that the prints weren't real. But I knew better. On the 7th day, I found the bones. It was behind the cabin, near a tangle of blackberry brambles. I was digging a shallow fire pit and turned up a rib. At first, I thought it was from a deer, but then I found a jaw. Human, still with a couple of molars. I dropped the shovel and backed away. My pulse was hammering. I stared at the pit for a long time. Then I forced myself to keep digging. I uncovered more bones, a full rib cage, and part of a spine. No clothes, no shoes, just bones, clean and old. Someone had buried a body behind the cabin. I didn't call the police. No signal. I could have driven back to the nearest town, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it then. Maybe part of me felt like I needed to understand what I'd walked into. Maybe part of me didn't want to explain why I'd been squatting in a cabin next to a graveyard. I decided I'd leave the next morning, pack everything and go. That night, the door opened on its own. I'd latched it. I was sure. I remember testing it twice before I climbed into the sleeping bag. But around 2 a.m., it creaked open. Slowly. I didn't see anyone in the frame, but I didn't step out to check. I locked it again and pushed the table in front of it. I sat up the rest of the night, knife ready, listening for any sound. The wind picked up just before dawn, carrying with it a smell I can only describe as sour and wet, like something rotting in deep water. I left as soon as it was light. I didn't even roll up the bag. I just stuffed everything in the boot and peeled out of the clearing like the trees were chasing me. Back in Birmingham, I spent 2 weeks sleeping with the lights on. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin, or the graveyard, or the bones. I didn't want the attention. I didn't want the questions. But something changed in me. Couldn't relax. Couldn't stop thinking about the prints in the dirt. The knock. The bones. I kept checking my locks twice. 3 times. Sometimes 4. I started sleeping with a hammer next to the bed. 3 months later, I went back. I had to. I needed closure. I tried reporting the bones anonymously, but nothing ever came of it. No news reports, no excavations, nothing. So I drove back the same route, found the sign for Harper's Grove, took the same gravel road. The cabin was gone, just gone. In its place was a patch of churned up earth, like it had been bulldozed. The graveyard was still there, but half the stones were broken now, and a new barbed wire fence ringed the perimeter. There were no signs, no warnings, just quiet. But near the edge of the woods, I saw something hanging from a branch. It was a chain, rusted, thick, and at the bottom was a wooden board, the same one from the porch swing. Still painted green, still cracked down the middle. That was all the proof I needed. Whatever had happened there, someone wanted it covered up, erased. I never went back again. But some nights, when it's cold and the wind shifts just right, I swear I can hear a knock on the side of my flat. One sharp thump, like a reminder, like something followed me home. Maybe it was never about the cabin or the graveyard. Maybe it was about me the whole time. And that's what keeps me up now. Not the fear of what I saw, but the fear that I invited it in. I was 31 when I decided to take a break from the city. That year, 2018, had burned me out completely. I was living in Leeds at the time, working long hours in a warehouse and dealing with the kind of repetitive stress that slowly crushes your brain. I had recently broken up with a girl I thought I'd marry, and my body was falling apart from years of physical work. I needed air, trees, silence. It was my older brother, Martin, who suggested we go to Dad's old cabin up in Northumberland. It wasn't technically ours, but no one had used it since our dad passed, and it had been in the family for decades. We used to visit it as kids in the early 2000s, mostly during summer holidays. It was surrounded by thick forest with only a gravel track that led out to a narrow country road. The nearest shop was about 11 miles away. It was the sort of place you could scream your lungs out and no one would hear a thing. Martin had left the city years ago. He worked odd jobs and lived in some small village near Carlisle, mostly keeping to himself. We hadn't spoken much in the last few years. Not out of anger, just life pulling us in different directions. He was more of a loner, always had been. Quiet but not unfriendly. But there was always a strange vibe with him I could never pin down. Like something under the surface, just barely hidden. We drove up in early October. The air was already getting cold. Leaves were falling in thick carpets. I met Martin at a service station just outside Newcastle. He didn't say much, just nodded when I got in his pickup. The inside of the truck smelled like stale coffee and old cigarette smoke. I noticed a large hunting knife on the dashboard. He caught me glancing at it and just shrugged, like it was normal. I didn't say anything. The road to the cabin had gotten worse. Gravel and moss, with grass creeping up the center. Trees pressed in from both sides, casting everything in shade even during the day. The place hadn't been touched in years. The windows were cloudy, the wooden steps warped, and moss was growing up the outer walls. It smelled like damp wood and dust when we opened the door. Inside, it was exactly how I remembered. 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area with an old stone fireplace, and a shed out back. No plumbing, no heating, just a well and a wood-burning stove. We brought food and water, and Martin said we'd collect firewood nearby. The first couple days were fine. We split chores. I cleaned the inside. Martin chopped wood and set up a fire. We cooked simple meals, canned food, bread, eggs, and drank beer in the evenings while watching the fire crackle. There was no signal, which was both relaxing and isolating. The silence out there was thick. At night, the forest sounded alive. Owls, wind in the branches, and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked through the window, There was nothing, just the trees swaying slowly. By the fourth day, things started to feel off. Martin was acting strange. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He wandered off into the woods for hours without saying where he was going. When I asked, he just muttered, "Needed to think." I caught him staring at me once in the middle of the night. I had gotten up to pee, and when I passed the living room, he was sitting in the dark, eyes fixed on the hallway like he was waiting for me. When I asked him what he was doing, he didn't answer. He just walked past me into the kitchen. The weirdest thing was the animals. Normally you'd expect to see some life in the forest, birds, squirrels, maybe a fox, but it was dead silent during the day. No movement, no birdsong. One morning I found a dead rabbit near the front steps. His neck had been snapped clean. No bite marks, no blood, just dead. I mentioned it to Martin and he barely reacted. Said it was nature doing what it does. That night I couldn't sleep. Something didn't feel right. I got up and went to the kitchen for water. On my way back, I saw Martin's bedroom door slightly open. I paused. Something caught my eye on the floor inside, metal. I pushed the door open quietly. He was sleeping with the hunting knife in his hand. I backed away and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep at all. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. I started thinking about things from our childhood. How Martin once broke a cat's leg and didn't care. How he used to hold my head underwater in the lake longer than necessary. How he once pushed a kid down a hill for no reason. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. The next day, I made up a lie. I said I needed to head back into town to check on something. Martin didn't say much, just nodded. I packed my bag, said I'd only be gone for a few hours, and walked out along the gravel track. But I didn't go into town. I hid behind some thick pine trees a few hundred yards down and waited. I had this sinking feeling that Martin would come after me, and I was right. About an hour later, I saw him walking fast down the track. He had the knife in his belt. He wasn't calling my name, wasn't pretending to be concerned. Just walking with purpose, scanning the trees. I stayed completely still, heart pounding in my throat. He walked past me, looking left and right. I waited until he was a good distance away, then ran back to the cabin. I don't know what exactly I was thinking. Maybe to grab the truck and leave. But I hadn't taken the keys. They were still in Martin's jacket. Panicked, I locked the cabin door and ran to the back shed. Inside was an old axe we used to use for chopping wood. I grabbed it and crouched behind the door, listening. It was almost an hour later when I heard footsteps outside. Slow, careful. Then a knock on the cabin door. Then silence. I didn't move. I just gripped the axe and waited. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of glass breaking. The back window. He was coming in. I should have run, but my body wouldn't move. I heard him step inside the cabin. He walked slowly, like he was enjoying it. I could hear his boots on the wooden floor, the slow creak with each step. Then he stopped. For a second, everything was silent. Then he called out my name. Not loud, just enough to be heard. I stayed in the shed for hours, waiting. At some point, I heard him leave. Then I heard the truck start. He drove off. I didn't leave the shed until morning. I walked the 11 miles into town on foot. Took half the day. I told the police everything, well, not everything. I told them I was staying at the cabin and that my brother had gone missing after acting strange. I left out the part about the axe and hiding in the shed. They found the cabin empty, the back window broken, some supplies missing. But no blood, no body, no knife. 2 weeks later, they found Martin's truck abandoned near Hadrian's Wall. No sign of him. No one's heard from him since. They listed him as missing, presumed dead. I moved to Bristol not long after. I don't talk about it with anyone. Not my girlfriend, not my coworkers, not even my therapist. But I still have nightmares about that cabin, about the silence, About the way he looked at me that last night like I wasn't his brother anymore, just a thing to be gotten rid of. Sometimes I think about the rabbit with its neck snapped, how clean it was, how quiet, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I wonder if he's still out there in those woods, watching, waiting, or maybe he really did just disappear into the forest like a shadow, leaving behind nothing but a broken window and a memory that won't fade. But I survived, and I never went back.